Defense attorneys, what is the worst offense you've ever had to defend? I had a brilliant gentleman on probation for narcotics trafficking and was not permitted to own/use a cell phone. He went in for a drug test with his probation officer and his cell rang in his pocket. The PO went to take the phone from his pocket and also pulled out a large bag of cocaine that he brought to his drug test. Next story. Not worst in so much as it was serious, but worst as in, geez, do I really have to do this? One time I was trying to defend a guy that was alleged to have thrown his piss in a woman's face. The kicker? The guy was an inmate and the woman was a guard at the prison, so it really takes things up a notch penalty-wise. Our defense? Her face tested positive for urea, a substance that is in human piss, but is also in an enormous variety of female beauty products. We had to basically argue that she put the piss on her own face through one of these products, and they couldn't prove the defendant didn't just throw water on her. I mean, I feel bad for the guard. I wouldn't want someone to throw piss in my face. Next story. A few years back, a predator in Tacoma, Washington, USA, was tried for several sex crimes against children. He filmed a lot of it, and during the trial, the videos were used as evidence against him. The kicker? He chose to act as his own defense and had a legal right to review all evidence against him in private. This allowed him to watch every video he made, over 28 hours of video. There was some public outcry. Next story. Posted elsewhere, but I defended a guy who sent poop through the mail to his ex-girlfriend from state prison. I don't know how it got past prison officials, but it did, and he didn't deny sending it. However, we went to trial because he wanted me to argue that the poop was expressive speech, and thus protected by the First Amendment. We lost. Next story. Criminal defense attorney here. I hate doing child-adult content cases. Not only is the crime reprehensible, but then I have to go and review the discovery myself, which I absolutely hate. Thankfully, haven't had one of those cases in a while. I also hate civil asset forfeiture, but for entirely different reasons. When I get a drug case where the client's assets are seized, not only do I have to deal with the criminal charges, but I'll also have to handle the civil asset forfeiture because that's what my firm does. I hate civil law, but it's quasi-criminal, so I can deal with it. But the whole asset forfeiture scheme is bullcrap. In my jurisdiction, if over $25,000 is seized, no criminal conviction is necessary for the DA to keep the money, which is entirely backwards. We will still have the civil trial, but it's by a lesser standard than a criminal trial, beyond a reasonable doubt versus clear and convincing evidence. There was a movement to reform the asset forfeiture laws, but the DA's association opposed it and effectively killed the reform. Their reasoning being that DA offices and police departments allocate and rely on asset forfeiture for a part of their budgets, which is essentially admitting that they have a cash incentive to rob people. Next story. The summer after my first year in law school, I worked in the public defender's office. Numerous attorneys had to defend clients who had allegedly essayed infants and toddlers. I guess, in order to cope with doing that, a lot of them made jokes out of it. I would hear somebody talking about a case, and an attorney would say something like, "Yeah, but did you see how that baby was dressed? She was asking for it." And I never knew how to feel about that. Horrible and distasteful, but they have to stand in court and represent those people. They can't get out of the case. I don't know, man. Next story. Public defender here. I once represented an 11-year-old charged with forcible sodomy against another 11-year-old. You will often see kids charged with essaying other kids, but it's rare to get a juvenile defendant that young. Sometimes the parents are overreacting to two kids playing doctor. Sometimes it's evidence that the kids themselves have been essayed by an adult. Juvenile cases get complicated. Juvenile sex cases get absurdly complicated. Between draconian laws that aren't really designed for juveniles, competency issues like how do you get a knowing, intelligent, and voluntary plea from a child, and moronic parents, it can get pretty overwhelming. Next story. Lawyer who did criminal work experience whilst training. I was part of the legal team that defended a man who killed his partner by beating her to death with his fists in their living room. We argued diminished responsibility, i.e. he was only guilty of manslaughter, not murder, as at the time of the assault he lacked the relevant mental capacity. Jury found against him and he was sent down for 25 years. Last thing he said to me was that he hopes to get to go to solitary with his guitar and that he would be better than Eric Clapton by the time he ever got out. Edit. This is a UK case and the client had been in and out of prison all of his life, so I assumed that he would know if he was allowed his guitar while inside. I took his word for it at least. The jury didn't believe that his previous and ongoing psychological problems, well evidenced by expert witnesses, had an effect on his mental state to such an extent that he lacked the mental capacity to commit murder. They believed that he committed the murder because he wanted to either kill or cause serious physical harm to his partner at the time. This is the men's REA for murder in the UK. And no, I don't feel bad about assisting in his case. He was innocent until proven guilty. And in the UK, we have equality of arms in criminal cases, i.e., his legal team has the same resources as the prosecution's. Next story. No details because of confidentiality, but I had to work on a file doing research. The specific issues were whether it is possible to have accidental butt penetration, i.e., whether wrong hole is ever a real thing, and if so, if it could result in a rectovaginal fistula, tearing the ass and vagina together to make one big unhappy hole. Short answers? Apparently yes. Risk factors include sexual inexperience, inebriation, and the dark? Apparently yes. Apparently there are very rare cases of consensual vaginal intercourse doing the same thing, so, I hope that image doesn't hit you at an inopportune moment. Well, everybody, I am proud to say that I have never caused such pain on a woman, and no one has ever caused such pain on me, so I hope that doesn't happen. I don't think, could you imagine having one hole for, let me stop, hold on, next, next story. Prior public defender. Child assault / SAs are the worst. That aside, I once defended a very, very nice 80-ish-year-old man who had been married for like 50 years, several kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids. He'd been charged with sexual acts with a horse. Turns out most of the community knew he'd been sexually interacting with livestock for many years, and they'd usually look the other way, but I guess he went too far with the horse. He pled guilty to the felony, but of course, got no jail time. Next story. Well, violent essays are never easy, particularly because predators tend to be extreme narcissists who are very angry at women because reasons. Elliot Rodger, the 2014 Santa Barbara killer, is a good example of the type, and was much more articulate than most. But the narcissism makes defending them a real chore, because they tend to be delusional. The victim will never testify. Less creepily, and setting aside sophsits and their ilk, I had a fellow who was dealing crack in a local bar when the cops did a closing check and recognized him as someone whose parole conditions prohibited him from being in bars. He brightly fled to the men's room, dead end, to flush his dope down, but they were right on his heels, so they had him. This frustrated him so badly that he pooped his pants and tried to fling the resulting product at the officers. He was never really clear on why I didn't think this was a triable case. Next story. I am a law clerk at a criminal defense firm. We take cases on appeal after the client has already pled guilty or been found guilty at trial. One of our clients is a convicted serial child assayer, but some of the offenses occurred when he was a juvenile himself, under 17 in my state, which the law treats differently. I was tasked with going through the paperwork that we received and figuring out which victims he had essayed when he was an adult, and which victims he had essayed when he was a juvenile to calculate his correct punishment range. Problem is, the official court documents all name the victims with pseudonyms, John Doe, etc., while the police reports use their actual names. There is no legend or index in the file to tell me which victim is which, and it's cheaper for my bosses to pay me to figure it out than to force the government to turn over a list. So I had to match the child victims to their code names based on their biographical details and their accounts of the abuse. I am so glad that I will be moving into prosecution in a month or so. Next story. Immigration law often intersects with criminal defense law, since having criminal convictions will get you banned from or kicked out of many countries. In my first year of practicing, I had to argue for a man convicted of essaying his young daughters to be allowed into my country, in order to help care for his disabled young step-granddaughter. Regarding the details of what he did to his daughters, who were around the ages of 6 to 8, was horrifying. The now adult daughters wrote letters saying that they'd forgiven him and had no problems trusting him around their own children. I just couldn't stop thinking that this guy was possibly going to be left alone with a little girl who couldn't move or talk, let alone defend herself from a convicted predator. Not that children should be expected to be able to defend themselves from a grown man. Then, a weird one was a guy who had a felony conviction for threatening and planning to kill his previous attorney. He needed to clear up this issue because of a job opportunity in my country. He sent me this bizarre manifesto about the government's conspiracies to poison people via tap water, and how it was all the fault of the homosexual girly men in powerful positions. I was scared I would be his next target, because he clearly had severe, untreated mental health issues, and all it would take was one lazy or sloppy border officer to let him slip through. Next story. Murder. Started out as a gang initiation carjacking turned murder when the juvenile initiate panicked, and the juvenile self-unalived at the juvie. Client was torn up as well and wanted to plead guilty, did psych evaluation and did a full pre-trial motions practice that lasted a year before we scheduled the plea. He wrote a very heartfelt apology to the girl's dad, and I gave it to him after the plea. Still filed habeas against me 2 years later, but that was sort of expected. Then there was child SA and incest, was abusing his daughter for about 5 years. After a vague outcry, police came to the house and recovered male juices-covered tissue from the girl's bedroom in the trash can. Almost got that evidence suppressed because the search was without a warrant, but with permission from his wife. He had previously refused consent but was led away to the station for questioning. Stories differ as to whether he did it voluntarily or was coerced or even just flat out arrested, and they re-asked for consent from the wife with no husband to contradict her. This one went almost a year as well, with a metric ton of motions. In the end, what the police got from the search corroborated the witness's testimony to the T, and he eventually decided to plea. But the one that affected me the most was a little kid who literally grew into a man while locked up for 2 cases, 2 counts of aggravated assaults and another case of armed robbery. He stayed in jail for almost 3 years while the cases worked themselves out. In the aggravated assault case, he was alleged to have shot 2 lifelong gangbangers due to some dispute. He was a skinny kid, maybe 150 pounds soaking wet, and those gangbangers were all over 6 feet and heavily built, and a long rap sheet each. Cross-examination on their records went effing textbook. They had around 5 convictions each, and I asked about the first 3 and then let them screw themselves by saying how they're different now, and how that's all old news and they don't do that no more. Right. Then you hit them with the subsequent convictions. You wouldn't think that that would work, that they would know what their own record is and wouldn't fall for this trick, but they do, every single time. Not guilty, but still locked up because of the armed robbery. Armed robbery went to trial, and we had an expert on eyewitness testimony, Professor Brigham. He was a professor at FSU, and along with Elizabeth Loftus, the preeminent expert in the field of human memory and eyewitness testimony. He dazzled the jury. Truthfully, I can't take any credit for this. Not guilty again. A few days later, he came to see me at my office. I still remembered a little skinny kid, but not anymore. In street clothes. This dude was built. Somehow I missed all of that, either looking through the partition glass at the jail or being preoccupied with other stuff in court. We always had a good rapport, so we spent a good hour talking about future plans, and that would be the last time I'd see him, however. A year or so later, he got arrested for murder and is now serving a life sentence. I think that if he had been convicted of some of the other charges, maybe he wouldn't have that murder. Maybe if he went away for 5 or 10 years, he could have come out more mature. Not a 20-year-old jacked up kid who's been deprived of fun things for the past 3 years. I deliberately kept myself ignorant of the specifics of the murder. Maybe he killed a useless gangbanging psychopath. Maybe he killed a nun. I think it's better not knowing. Next story. Although the offense itself wasn't particularly repugnant, I once had to defend someone who had been charged for driving with a suspended license because he was, quite honestly, in his and my opinion, on his way to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting to prevent himself from drinking. He was a very serious alcoholic who had been convicted of impaired driving several times, and he had found out that the only way he could stay sober was by attending AA meetings regularly. On this particular day, his license was suspended because of a prior conviction. He lived quite a distance outside of town, and his friend who typically drove him into town canceled at the last minute. So, in a panic, worried that without attending the meeting he would relapse and inevitably end up hurting someone else, quite possibly by driving impaired again, he drove his own vehicle, stone cold sober, into town. On the way in, he was stopped by the police and charged with driving with a suspended license. In court, I wasn't sure whether to tell the judge that despite the delay on the roadside and the laying of a very serious additional criminal charge to this poor guy's history, he managed to call his AA sponsor who picked him up on the side of the highway and drove him to the meeting, just in time, only to arrive a few minutes late, and stay sober for 24 hours, albeit with a reduced likelihood of the same positive outcome on the sobriety front the following day. Next story. I hate representing child predators. Aggravated essay of a child. If the allegation came from a wife during divorce proceedings, then I always thought I had a chance, because it was common to allege that in order to deny visitation. Go on, sweetie, tell the policeman and judge that daddy touched you. But I always felt bad for the 19-year-old girl with the 15-year-old. When it was consensual, but the 15-year-old doesn't have the legal authority to consent, so the teenager boy would be rung up for essay of a child. In other cultures and other countries, a 19-year-old with a 15-year-old is accepted, but in my state, it's a second-degree felony. Then the stepfather-stepdaughter. If I had one of those cases, the guy was guilty 99 out of 100 times. The thing that made me sick would be the "you don't understand, she wanted me" line. Really? She's 11 and you're 39. But the worst? The biological father feeling up his daughter. He'd wait by the bathroom door as she would finish her shower, and he'd pull off her towel and feel her up saying, "I'm your father, I have a right to see how you're developing." This went on for years until she finally got sick of it and told a teacher, who told the cops. She was 14 years old when she finally got up the guts to turn in her own father. But he ran off before the case was resolved. But he was caught many years later, when his daughter was a full-grown adult, and she didn't want to revisit those days, so some lesser charge was worked out by some different attorney. I quit accepting those cases 15 years ago. Next story. I had a client who was a narco in Colombia extradited to the US, killed more people than he could count, actually lost track. Then there was a guy who made videotapes of himself essaying his 6-year-old daughter, then a guy who killed another person in a road rage incident and shot his dog, strafed bullets across the windshield to scare the guy's wife, then went home and went to bed. I could go on for days. Next story. My client essayed his daughters over a period of years. It went to a full jury trial. Cross-examining the children was very unpleasant. My client was convicted. The evidence was overwhelming. I made clear before trial that he was going down, but the defendant would not take a plea. The judge, in an unrecorded discussion held while the jury was out, told the prosecutor and me to do our utmost to make certain there were no appealable issues since the defendant was a monster. I hated every minute of that trial, but I did my utmost to represent my client. Next story. Oh, I also had a guy stand out of a sunroof and point an AR-15 at an undercover cop. Guy was on probation when this happened. Then there was co-worker represented a guy that beat and burned a kitten and recorded it. She had to watch the video and she came to my office crying afterwards. F that guy. Next story. The 90-year-old woman who routinely struggled drugs in her vagina into prisons was more interesting than most. The gang murderers are pretty routine at this point. As a young lady, it's the ones who aren't killing in the name of territory, street cred, etc. that get to me. I was really affected by our particularly brutal, cold, calculated, sick 30-something man accused of murder. He was eerily calm and cocky about his encounter with an underage girl he met and chatted up for about 20 minutes that resulted ultimately in her drowning with suspicious surrounding circumstances. He was obviously disturbed, and it was very unsettling just being near him. Images of him smiling for the news cameras in the courtroom will weirdly pop into my head on a somewhat random basis, and it still gives me the heebie-jeebies. And the act he put on when he insisted upon being put on the stand in trial ruined him. He would have walked but for his ridiculous testimony. Within seconds, the jury who had been paying close attention previously looked horrified as he told these stories and stopped taking notes. Their minds were made up as soon as he opened his creepy mouth. He was quickly convicted. We did a really stellar job in his case, but he dug his own grave. Justice was served. Next story. Worst I had was when my client was charged with impersonating a police officer. It was the worst because it was so ridiculous. He was 70 years old and was going to the Social Security office. When he went through the metal detector, he had a police shield that he put in the tray with keys and phone. He collected police memorabilia and liked to carry it around. The guard at the metal detector arrested him. Next story. I have been a prosecutor and defense counsel for over 20 years. Your question caused me to reflect on the moral ambiguity of what the worst was for me. I've seen people do horrible things for almost good reasons, and people commit rather minor crimes based on the vile rationalizations and/or intentions that they have. Sometimes the worst thing that happened was because of another prosecutor or lawyer, judge, or even a jury. Watching someone go to jail who you strongly believe to be innocent is a terrible thing that keeps you up at night. I suppose the ones I consider to be the worst are those where the victims are children or animals. In almost all of those cases involving adults, there being exceptions, one often finds their victim had it coming or played some role in their own misfortune. That does not excuse the crime, but it makes it less difficult for me. So the ones involving kids and animals are difficult because you know they played no role whatsoever in the misfortune that was visited upon them. Now, a warning for what follows, sexual content and children harmed. One that kept me up for many nights was where police responded to a stabbing and found a house of messed up natives, unconscious or so wasted that they were unable to walk or talk. In the basement, they found a male tied to a post who had been essayed with a broomstick and then stabbed to death. In an upstairs bedroom, they found a baby who was near death due to dehydration. The mother, one of the passed-out individuals, had given the baby a bottle of apple juice at the beginning of the day on a Friday. Note, apple juice is a terrible thing to give to a baby nutritionally. She then proceeded to go on a multi-day bender, multiple drugs and alcohol, and forgot about her baby. Yeah, just like train spotting. The baby had peed and pooed in her diapers, and at some point it just sat in its own filth for the entire weekend. She had diaper rash so bad it required a skin graft and massive antibiotics during a lengthy hospitalization. The dehydration and deprivation of food caused permanent brain injury and other health complications, so we hate the mother, right? Turns out the baby was the product of an SA by one of her uncles who showed up at the party. He was a nasty bastard involved with a hardcore native gang, had prior convictions for assault and battery, SA, robbery, and manslaughter. Anyways, when he got wasted at the party, the mother confronted him about SAing her, and a big row happened. Her boyfriend and her brother took the uncle to the basement, tied him up, tortured, and killed him. Her response was to get more effed up and completely forget about her whole life, including her daughter in the crib upstairs. At the end of the day, she was charged with negligence and deprivation, her brother and boyfriend with murder. All I could think about at times was what kind of life that baby girl was going to have. She would be about 20 years old now if still alive. I am frightened to think what became of her. So this one was really well written and put in an eloquent form and just really paints a perspective that we've done a few lawyer videos in the past on this channel. I've read some, I'm sure the other narrators have read some. And it's not a black and white thing, unfortunately, and you just have to compartmentalize parts of yourself and deal with it and realize, like, yes, I hate this person, but I have a job to do. Like, being a lawyer is not easy. I don't think anyone's saying that, but you hear those jokes sometimes about lawyers being soulless and heartless, but I feel like you kind of have to at times and put your heart away, otherwise you're going to come back completely shattered. Not that these cases probably don't affect these people, but if you put all your heart into it, I really don't know how you come out emotionally better. But anyway, that's just what I think. Next story. So, I'm not a defense attorney, but I worked a brief stint at the public defender's office during law school. While I worked there, I took care of a lot of bail hearings and other simpler things. If you spend any time working for the PD, you will quickly learn the names of repeat offenders who come in on a monthly, if not weekly basis. One such fellow, let's call him Stan, liked to do drugs. I was informed by the DA's office that he had a warrant out for a probation violation, so I gave Stan a call and told him to turn himself in. Now, as I said, Stan was a regular and knew all of the drills. If you turn yourself in or get picked up, after a certain time, you wear your street clothes in front of the judge instead of the sexy little jumpsuit. As it turns out, he turned himself in with a crack pipe in his pocket. This can't get any worse, right? Wrong. I'm thinking that Stan has to be the dumbest man to face that courtroom when I look up and see him being escorted into the courtroom by the bailiff wearing a shirt that says high as F. Let's just say that his bail hearing was about as successful as the rest of his life choices. Next story. I had to defend a guy who was caught in a public park, after dark, self-pleasuring with used, dirty baby diapers. The police rolled up on him doing it, shined their spotlight on him, and he looked at them and said, "I have problems." Also defended a guy that walked up to a rival gang member and shot him in the face. Then he and his buddies fled and got involved in a high-speed chase, and he was shooting out the window at the chasing cops. I had to interview him alone at the downtown Modesto County Jail, which is a total crap hole. It was the first murderer I ever defended, and I was scared. He turned out to be very polite, though. Next story. Paralegal here, criminal defense. My first case was helping defend a father who S8 his daughter since the age of 8 and promised her a puppy if she would let him stick it in all the way. After she turned 12 during an assembly in school entitled, "Is Someone Hurting You? Tell Someone," she started crying and ran out of the assembly and finally told someone. She brought that 4-year-old dog with her to court as her support animal while giving her testimony because the father denied it until the end. Despite DNA on sex toys and the victim identifying the specific adult content sites the father made her watch, his computer, and both their mixed DNA all over the furniture, in the bathroom, the cushions, etc. They also had his computer from the pawn shop that he took it to and attempted to reinstall Windows, not knowing that the files are still there. The father worked in the Department of Corrections and told the daughter that daddy would get killed if she ever told anyone. And that was my first case. Started drinking whiskey after that. Oh, so much whiskey. And started becoming desensitized to these effed up cases so much that I would laugh out loud at dinner events when answering, "So, what are you working on?" I could silence a dinner party in 5 seconds flat. He was found guilty and got 45 years. I quit as a paralegal after 6 months on the job. It started taking my soul. Next story. So, I'm just a law student, but I worked on a pro bono case where we represented sex offenders who had committed repeated offenses. Basically, the legislature passed a law around 2007-ish that all sex offenders who had committed repeat offenses had to wear GPS trackers, which some attorneys felt was a violation of their rights. This might be dandy if it was a going forward thing, but it applied retroactively. The state initially won in showing it was not an ex post facto punishment, but the challenges are currently in the middle of a Fourth Amendment unreasonable search series of challenges. Also, many of the people monitored were repeat offenders only because they committed another crime, not necessarily another sex offense, after the first sex offense conviction. I never met any of them, but I think the party in our case was the kind of sympathetic background story that demonstrated the law's foolishness. Next story. As I mentioned in an earlier comment, I'm not a defense attorney, but I did work briefly for the public defender's office during law school. While there, I was assigned to a prostitution case. My client was an Asian lady in her 60s who had resorted to selling her services on Backpage.net. Her business was quite lucrative, so she started pimping out a few other girls as well. My client didn't speak a word of English, or so I thought. So we brought in a translator to get the lowdown for the client. The next 30 minutes was the second most embarrassing and awkward experience in my life. Through a translator, she regaled me with the story of how she got into the business and how she had started pimping and her specialties in the trade. At one point, I'm even fairly certain she was trying to hit on me, but I digress. She told me about her ad that she had posted and how she had gotten a service call on that ad from an undercover cop. After a while, she needed to take a break, so I briefly scanned over the incident report that my colleague had just dropped off. Apparently, the officer arrived at the door, was forcefully yanked through the door by a shirt collar, and offered butt sex. He noted that the only things in the hotel room were a 50-pack of condoms and a Costco-sized tub of Vaseline. Needless to say, we sought a plea bargain. Then, the most embarrassing moment of my life came shortly after when I had to walk her through her guilty plea and repeat, in front of the judge and on the record, the only English words she knew were, $50 get you anal. I'm trying so hard not to laugh. But $50, folks, get you anal. Not a bad deal. Just saying if you're into it. Maybe... I'm not finishing that sentence. Oh, we have fun here, don't we? Next story. For me, definitely essay of a child. He did it, but he had a good defense. It was her word against his, and the detective testified that he believed the child on the stand, which is improper bolstering. I had to object, but the court overruled me. He was convicted. I had to appeal. I lost the appeal, but I was right. The detective should not have said that. Next story. Really late, but a friend of mine's dad is a defense attorney. He once had a client who strangled a hooker to death because she laughed at him because he couldn't get a boner after shooting heroin directly into his private parts. Her dad's half-assed defense was, well, Your Honor, in his defense, he was really high from heroin, so he wasn't thinking very clearly. The guy was quickly sentenced to many years in prison. Next story. Copyright defense attorney here. Lots of people have been put through the ringer over BitTorrent downloads in the last few years. My favorite story is not from my client, but from the same case. During one of the first civil BitTorrent file-sharing cases, it became clear to me, and the plaintiff, that one defendant was lying. The guy had erased his hard drive to destroy evidence after recovering the discovery requests for the computer. He then reinstalls Windows and names the drive Squeaky. He puts it onto an encrypting USB enclosure and hands it over. It took them a while, but they figured it out. The guy got hit with a $241,000 judgment for 5 downloads. Next story. Client was charged with child abuse. She had a history of drug use and was married to a man that was hitting her and her child. One of the allegations from CPS was that the husband had hit the child with a baseball bat. So my client had criminal charges against her, and her ex-husband, the biological father, was petitioning for custody of the child and termination of my client's parental rights. After 3 years of untangling this entire situation, we came to a resolution. My client separated from her second husband, the abuser, went to inpatient rehab, lost custody, but retained generous visitation rights. 2 months after the case was over, I got a call from my client, from prison. Apparently, her plan all along was to pretend to leave her second husband and reconnect with him when the case was over. That's fine, but she also kidnapped her child during one of her visits and took her to Florida to start over with her second husband. Authorities couldn't find her for weeks. She received a suspended sentence, probation, and termination of her parental rights. I seriously hope I never hear from her again. If I do, she'll be the first client I refuse to represent. I hate her. Next story. Okay, I'll pop in here. Years ago, there was a silent alarm that went off at the petting part of the zoo at about 3 a.m. Usually nothing, so the cops don't show up, lights flashing and guns blazing. So they're walking around, taking a look, and find a guy on a stool just going at it with a cow. Now, this is one of the most unfortunate-looking human beings you can imagine. Dude is hideous, and honestly, you feel kind of sorry for him, and understand that the petting zoo is a logical place, in his mind, to find sexual partners. Cops arrest him and put him in holding. Because of the timing of it all, it was just before shift change, so every cop working in the precinct has to come by and laugh at the cow puffer. Then they tell the story to all the guys coming on shift, so they all go by and do the same thing. We got an initial hearing that morning, big city, and when I tell the judge that story, he throws out the case and tells the guy he's been punished enough by the embarrassment. Next story. A friend of the family is a lawyer who has a favorite story he likes to tell. Basically, he had to defend someone who just randomly punched a stranger, a 90-year-old grandmother, in the face one day, in front of a dozen witnesses, evidently just because he was in a bad mood. The only defense he could come up to give before the judge was, "Your Honor, he only hit her once." Next story. The most heinous? A child essayer who, on being asked his side of the story, told me that it was exactly what was written in the charge sheet. The charge sheet was basically dictated by him to the police. Then the worst, 3 guys took their dad's brother out drinking, got him sozzled to the point he passed out, beat the crap out of him in his own house while his wife is screaming in the corner, stole money, jewelry, and electronics from his house, and then ran away. The case is on trial about 6 months later, and they, the 3 guys, my clients, walk into my office with their uncle after treating him to a generous amount of hooch, saying he wants to withdraw the case. I tell him to appear before the court. He appears, sozzled and stinking of liquor from a mile off, and the judge refuses to quash the proceedings. The 3 guys pull a gun on him right outside the court complex. At that point, I noped the F out of that case. Next story. Not actively working defense, but in law school, worked as a law clerk on almost exclusively violent offenses, including the following exceptional charges. First off, the murder of an infant. The alleged crime was via shaken baby/SIDS. Then there was murder of a police officer, murder of a sleeping grandmother in her own bedroom with a blunt instrument. The violence involved in the offense was shocking. The cast-off basically painted the room. And contract killing on a quiet residential street in broad daylight. Victim dated the wrong female. Next story. This guy kidnapped, essayed, tortured, and killed his then-girlfriend while his other girlfriend helped. He recorded the whole thing on video. He also was recorded talking with the girlfriend who helped him about moving the thing in the backyard, which during his defense he said they were talking about a safe that was buried. But he was acquitted on all counts, and a couple of years after the trial, he moved to a new house. The people who bought his house took up some carpeting and found an air conditioning vent. Inside the vent were the videos of him killing his victim. But he can't be retried due to double jeopardy. I think they might have gotten him for perjury since he obviously lied during his first trial, but that's it. Next story. Former public defender in Chicago, my district included the Carbini Green Complex, among many contenders for this question. Here it is, though. A very young couple had a baby they were woefully unprepared for and did not want. After a few months, they strangled the baby to death. In order to dispose of the body, they cut it into bits, put the pieces into a blender, and tried to feed the blended remains to some dogs. The dogs would not eat it, or eat all of it, so they tried to dissolve the remainder in battery acid. That did not work either, so they flushed the last bits down the toilet. People were asking where the baby was, and they were making up various lies. They had borrowed the blender from some neighbors, but did not or could not clean it thoroughly before returning it. The neighbors were struck by the awful smell coming from the mechanism of the blender and took it apart to clean it. A cousin of the neighbors was a nurse and knew about the missing baby. She figured out what was in the blender and called the police. The defendants were questioned and each blamed the other for the actual murder. However, they came to their decision. The prosecutors cut a deal with the mother in order to pin it on the father. The father was looking at so much time that it was worth it to take the case to trial and try to blame the mother. There really wasn't any way to know who did the actual killing, but nobody was going to vote not guilty on that one. Next story. Not necessarily the worst, but my weirdest and most disgusting case happened a couple of years ago. I got appointed to represent a woman whom was charged with felony possession of infectious biological substances with the intent to cause bodily injury to another. You see, this fine, upstanding citizen had a relationship with a gentleman recently ended because he was cheating on her by sleeping with her neighbor. So, to get her revenge, she concocted a plan in which she would steal her ex-boyfriend's underwear, harvest pubic lice from another friend whom was infected by having the friend keep his balled-up underwear under her underwear in contact with the friend's crotch region for about a week, then return the underwear to the ex-boyfriend's dresser drawer, spreading it to the rest of his undergarments, so that he would get infected and also spread it to her neighbor. This was all going to plan until the woman with the pubic lice got arrested for a list of things: prostitution, drug possession, firearm by a convicted felon, amongst other charges, and while being arrested/booked on those other charges, spilled the beans about my client's plan when they asked why she was searched. She had a man's underwear balled up in the front of her underwear. My client insisted on having a jury hear the case because, in her words, once all of them hear what I got to say, they all know he had it coming. I have never been literally embarrassed trying to defend a client and make any argument on her behalf before or since. She consistently showed up to court in sweatpants and a t-shirt with flip-flops and socks, even after we had offered to purchase inexpensive, respectable clothes for her and expense them as a part of her defense if she didn't have any. But she refused and consistently told us, "This ain't no big deal. Y'all making this out to be a big deal," even after several reminders of the possible consequences of conviction. And you could smell her throughout the courtroom, and we knew this because I found out from the bailiff after the fact that the judge, who sits about 40 feet from the defendant's table, had him Lysol down her chair once everyone had cleared out the courtroom after each hearing. And she had a group of friends who came to her hearings and kept making uncalled for outbursts and had to be removed from the courtroom twice, and on the second time told not to return again or they would be put in jail, thus prejudicing the judge and jury against her cause even further. Then her infected friend even testified against her. Then my client insisted on testifying against my literal begging and pleading her to decide not to, and you could see the look of disgust and restrained attempts to not vomit on the faces of the judges and jurors as she showed no remorse or understanding that what she did was wrong, only that he had it coming, and by making claims of that, "That's just what happens in our neighborhood when a girl gets disrespected by a man." And after her testimony and cross, I requested a recess, and thankfully the Commonwealth's attorney was an old school law buddy of mine who made me a good offer. I managed to convince her to take a plea to a lesser charge of A plus B, no jail time, but she would have to testify against a friend charged with gang crimes at a later date in another matter they were prosecuting. So our case is laid over until the other trial, which is only 3 weeks away, where she cooperates with the Commonwealth Attorney's Office up to the point when she is sitting on the witness stand when she changes her mind and refuses to rat out her homies. Now I have to go back before the court, re-impanel the jury, and have them convict her and sentenced to the minimum 5 years. A good portion ended up being suspended, but I don't remember the exact amount. I think she only ended up serving like 7 months active jail time. The worst part, though, was the almost hour-long tongue lashing the judge gave her, saying how disgusting a human being she was, and how he really should give her more, and how disgusted he was to have even sit and listen to her speak. Then, of course, afterwards, this is all my fault. My only legal argument was that genital crabs was not an infectious biological substance as the legislature intended, which I do think should have been still held to this day. But the judge disagreed and said the way in which the pubic lice here was used akin to a biological weapon based upon her own admitted intended use, because she literally admitted under cross-examination herself every other element of the crime needed to convict her. I noted her appeal and withdrew from the case, got the judge to appoint another attorney whom I know was a good appellate lawyer, and then left, went back to the office, poured a drink, and wept for the future of humanity. I later learned nothing ever came of her appeal. Okay, look guys, so I don't condone cheating, but I feel like if you were dating the male or the female equivalent of just that human being, I don't think I would want to put my anything in that. I don't think I want to put my energy in the same room as a person like that. This sounds like the kind of person who, if they had COVID, would cough on a coworker they hate to get revenge on them or something like that. This is the type of person we're dealing with. Anyway, next story. So, did my 1L summer in an indignant legal aid firm. 90% of the work involved domestic abuse cases, and the other 10% involved slumlord disputes. But the worst part of it was learning about what my boss called the Nigerian cycle. I'm sure that sounds offensive, but the county has a large population of Nigerian immigrants, and this was a very common sequence for us to see amongst those families. It usually began with the father or male family figure, sometimes brothers and cousins as young as 13, essaying the youngest male child. Girls were essayed, but less frequently. Essay is bad enough, but it usually was very violent and all too often involved water sports. After the essay, we would usually get a request from the mother to get a TPO against the abuser and temporary emergency custody of the victim. We would not have taken these cases if we weren't obligated to. I know that sounds odd, but it's because this is a two-step cycle. Almost without fail, you'd see our former client get brought up on child abuse charges, and if they ended up in TPO court, we would hear the same story every time. Without fail, the kids were getting brutally beaten by the family that took them in after the essay because they were either now suspected of being gay or because the family wanted to make sure that wasn't the case. And that is what let me know that I did not want to touch poverty law with a 10-foot pole. Next story. Oh, I just remembered this one. This was probably the nastiest case I remember in all of my time at the PD's office. Wasn't my client, but a friend of mine's in the office. Guy's name was Ramon. They call him Ramon the Bone. Well, he violently essayed a 70-plus-year-old woman. He beat the crap out of her, put his finger in her behind, then wiped it on her face. Essayed her, and then made her perform oral on him. Real effed up stuff. Guy was a total a-hole. Went all the way to trial. Jury selection was fun, but he was found guilty. Can't remember what his sentence was, but it was many years. Next story. Insurance defense attorney here. A guy had an injury, back surgery, and a bad result. He took his own life. However, he left a note saying he took his own life because his girlfriend found out he was married and had left him. Back injury was accepted. Causation to death was disputed. We had a hearing. The other side put the wife on the stand to establish entitlement to the policy. I had to put the girlfriend on to establish a foundation for the self-unaliving note and the real reason he took his own life. Plaintiff's attorney never told his client, the wife, in advance why the insurance company was disputing death benefits. Girlfriend did not do well reading the note out loud and being questioned. Wife did not do well finding out her husband had not just been cheating, but that strongly involved with someone else. Nasty day. Nasty day. Well, folks, these are all the lawyers' stories that we have for you this time. We read a lot of those. I've been reading a lot of these lawyer stories recently, and they're sad and depressing a lot of the times. And every now and then they're funny. But, I feel like any job that requires you to work with the people, you're going to meet peculiar characters. Same with fast food or customer service or just anything like that. People are dumb, and unfortunately, they exist to hopefully make us look smarter. But remember, every idiot here that you heard about can probably vote, and that's very scary. But anyway, guys, we're at the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching, commenting. Have a really good day, and bye-bye!